Hello and welcome everybody to Network 2020's webinar about sanctions. My name is Courtney Dogger and I'm the president of Network 2020. I am really pleased to be here today. It seems like sort of uncanny timing in a way. When we had originally started thinking about doing another briefing on sanctions, it was really in response to the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and the desire of so many countries not to recognize the Taliban, or at least to receive concessions regarding human rights on the one hand, and the sad truth that doing so would exacerbate a growing humanitarian crisis on the other. And so that was what we were originally thinking when we started to conceive of this briefing. But as so often happens, events on the ground really overtake our planning, obviously with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent economic and political measures that countries have taken in response. With several Russian banks already disconnected from the SWIFT banking system, and Russia seeming to be escalating its military measures, the reported military strike or missile strike on Kiev's TV tower not too long ago. There's clearly a lot to talk about today about where we go from here. But just to start, what I would like to do is focus on the broader context during the initial conversation, and then I'm sure we will also get to a lot of questions about Ukraine, Russia, and even Afghanistan in the Q&A as well. So just before we begin, I just wanted to say a few words about Network 2020. So we are an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. We run a lot of different programs. This briefing series is one of many. We do encourage you to follow us on social media. If you like this briefing and want to share it afterwards, it will be on YouTube. So please do follow us on all the social media places. So with that, it's really my honor to introduce our guests. We have three fantastic people here today. I won't do their full bios so that we can leave more time for the conversation, but we're very fortunate to have Ambassador Daniel Fried. One of his many accomplishments is the fact that he worked on sanctions policy against Russia following Russia taking Crimea in 2014. So he also worked with the former Soviet Union in many capacities with NATO. So he is really well versed in that whole area. So we're extremely fortunate to have him today. We're also joined or rejoined by Erica Moret, who has talked with us about sanctions before, and she is a senior researcher at the Global Governance Center and the Geneva Center of Humanitarian Studies. And she has done a lot of work on sanctions, including humanitarian impacts and the effects of de-risking. So we're very glad to have her today. And last but not least, we have Professor Benjamin Coates. He is an associate professor of history at Wake Forest. And he's currently in the middle of a book that's really looking at sanctions, US sanctions policy since probably around World War I, if I recall correctly, but really taking an in-depth look on a topic that not that many people have looked into. So welcome to each of you. We're so fortunate to have you here today. So with that, let me see, I would like to begin, and I'd like to begin where I usually like to start, which is with context. And so, Ben, I'd like to turn to you first. Could you just tell us a little bit about the developments that led to the use of sanctions as one of the most favored tools for the US and other governments to respond to foreign policy challenges? And how has our concept of them evolved over time? As well as some of the mechanics of when or how a country may choose to utilize sanctions. I realize that that's a really broad question, but you're the expert, so I will leave it to you to focus and give us some of that necessary context. Thank you.
Sure, happy to do that. And thanks to everyone for coming out today. So I guess the place where modern sanctions really begin is in the years after World War I. There was this attempt to take the strategies of wartime blockade and then use them as an enforcement mechanism for the League of Nations. Unfortunately, the sanctions failed to stop Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and there's an argument that they may have actually encouraged Japanese and German aggression that led to World War II. So while there is some sanctioning activity by various powers during the Cold War, it's really not until the 1990s that we see sanctions really emerge again as a tool of global governance. And just as an example, in the entire Cold War period from 45 to 1990, sanctions were only used by the UN one time, or at least comprehensive sanctions only imposed once. And then in the 1990s alone, you see a dozen countries being sanctioned by the United Nations. So, what changed in the 1990s? We could look at a couple of things. First of all, the end of the Cold War, of course, removes the threat of Soviet veto or Russian veto, at least for a while, allowing the UN to impose more sanctions than it might have been able to otherwise. And also really sort of undermines the idea of sovereignty and leads to this growing belief that you could use sanctions to promote humanitarian ends, whether that's human rights or stopping arms trafficking or the drug trade or trading in illegal diamonds or all kinds of things. So that's one really important development. The second is the rise of this idea of targeted sanctions. There's, you all may remember the sanctions against Iraq after the first Gulf War contributed to a humanitarian crisis that received a lot of international condemnation. And in the wake of that, scholars and practitioners came up with this idea of targeted sanctions that, by focusing on the sort of the bad guys, you could target their funds, you could stop them from traveling, and you could sort of localize the pain while minimizing collateral damage. I think it's not a coincidence that language kind of comes from the military at the time, which is interested in the rise of precision guided munitions. So this idea that sanctions could perform allegedly a similar kind of impact. We see that's important too. And then third, globalization, right? Just the expansion in the 90s of trade and investment, and the fact that so much of that takes place in dollars. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the US government figures out how to weaponize the dollar, basically. So it creates blacklists and then tells financial institutions you're not allowed to do any business with any person or company that's on these lists. And this convinces the banks to enforce this system of sanctions, which becomes very powerful. And then I guess the last thing is just that sanctions became the go-to tool for American presidents, in part because of the legacy of legislation that had given the executive branch the unilateral power to impose sanctions without needing to go to Congress. And that's combined with, after the second Iraq War, the lack of interest among most of the American public in using military force. So sanctions become, an easier way to spread, or at least try to project American power overseas. And I guess the last thing I'd say is that, by the 2010s, I don't know if we're calling them the teens yet, but whatever that the previous decade is, there's a sense of sanctions as a way of projecting American power with relatively few costs. I think Dr. Moret will talk about the rise of criticisms related to the humanitarian impact of sanctions on targeted countries. But there's a sense, or at least I think an assumption, that American sanctions don't have much impact on the average American. And so, one thing that might be interesting to talk about today is whether sanctions on Russia challenge these assumptions going forward.
Great, thank you so much. All right, Ambassador Freed, I'd like to turn to you now. So talking a little bit about effectiveness of sanctions, can they be an effective alternative to warfare as a means to compel powerful states to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do? And to that end, in your experience, what conditions need to be in place for sanctions to work, both on the side of those imposing the measures and on the effective governance? And of course, I think we'd probably all love to hear a little bit about Russia at this point too.
Your question is a logical one, but it's also odd. Do we ask, does war work? Does diplomacy work? The obvious answer is dumb wars don't work. Badly planned wars fail. Good diplomacy works, bad diplomacy fails. You see where I'm headed with this. It's usually, the question suggests, and this was not your intent. I mean, I'm being arch and difficult on purpose. The question suggests that the imposition of sanctions has to result in instant achievement of your maximal objectives or sanctions have failed. Like, would you apply that to diplomacy? Diplomacy is half measures, rotten compromises, framing the issue so you get, somewhere without a blow up. Or diplomacy is to isolate the aggressor, as we've seen with Russia. Okay, so with that arch introduction, sanctions are a tool of policy. They are as effective as that policy is smart. You see where I'm headed. People who impose sanctions can be guilty of greed or impatience, by which I mean asking too much of sanctions. Case in point, the Iranian sanctions. Did they succeed or fail? Well, they got Iran to negotiate an imperfect, arguably flawed deal, the JCPOA, that's better than the alternative. Then the Trump administration comes in, they increase the sanctions, back to where they were before, but they massively increased their demands. Secretary Pompeo once had a list of 13 demands of the Iranians, which were essentially stop being bad guys. Well, that's nice, but that's like me wishing I were a basketball star. Okay, like, no. That's greed. Impatience is, I want my results right away. Or the more common problem, you've promised the president or the secretary of state in your memo the results, in time for X event. It doesn't work that way. Policymaking is not like a seminar. So let me give you another case in point. The Carter administration and then the Reagan administration imposes, well, it wasn't exactly sanctions because Ben Coates was, of course, right. The modern financial sanctions didn't come into play until after we kind of messed around in Yugoslavia and didn't know what we were doing. It's kind of thing that was developed in the 20th century, Bush administration especially. Okay, so we put all this pressure on the Soviet Union. And as we were doing it, it was regarded as a failure and messy and complicated and backwards and forwards and arguments with allies. And it was obviously a failure and it obviously didn't work. And it was mocked by right-thinking professors of Soviet studies everywhere. And most of, a lot of the Foreign Service working on, Soviet policy. And guess what? Its strategic effect was enormous. And it was one of the precipitating factors in the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. But it didn't happen quite the way we wanted to. The Reagan people thought the Soviets would just bleed and scream. Instead, they were defiant and aggressive. But sanctions combined with the failure of the Soviet economy to modernize and the political failure to work with, to be anything than sclerotic, led to the conditions for Gorbachev to try to reform the system, which was impossible. So did sanctions work or not work? I mean, I don't know, kind of, but not the way we wanted them to. You see my point. I'm speaking as a policy veteran. I am not actually a sanctions academic or specialist. I was 4 years the sanctions coordinator at the State Department. I had people on my team who were sanctions experts, and I learned to listen to them. But I have a lot of experience in sort of policy and its unintended consequences. All right?
Terrific.
My do's and don'ts for sanctions follow. Don't get greedy, don't be impatient, and mean it, and work with allies. By mean it, look, you're going to have to sustain this and enforce it. And you're going to have American companies coming to you and screaming, pleading, or in my case, a couple of times threatening. It was great. Yeah, you could get in trouble if you did this. You know, the Congress won't like it. I mean, I had it all. Okay, I had it all. Do sanctions work? Case study of Russia. Okay, 2014, Russia invades Crimea and then a few weeks later attacks the Donbass. We weren't ready. I mean, like nowhere. The thought of sanctioning Russia was just ridiculous. We're doing the reset. What are you talking about? You know, Fried, Cold Warrior, Toria Nuland, Cold Warrior. So we got a lot of blank looks of incomprehension, but Putin kept escalating. And then we got our mandate to go ahead, but our sanctions were slow, incremental. We were feeling as we went, and they built up eventually by the summer of 2014 to a medium level, much bigger than any sanctions we'd ever, much more effective, hit against the Russian economy than anything we applied during the Cold War. I mean, though the economies were so different, it's not really comparable. And we got the Europeans on board. Now, did they work or not? Well, what they succeeded in doing is getting Putin to retreat somewhat. He stepped back. Early in the crisis, he had claimed wide areas of Ukraine, just like he's doing now, right? He had claimed about 40% of the territory. And we'll see whether he comes back to this. He dropped that fast. And he even embraced the Minsk Accords. Everybody hates them, but nobody knows what is in them. The Minsk Accords started with the agreed proposition that the Donbass is Ukrainian territory. And then the Minsk Accords outline how to get that territory back in Ukrainian hands, starting with a ceasefire, with changes to provide not for autonomy or federalization of Ukraine, but for decentralization, local rights. Maybe a special relationship, like a trading relationship with Russia. And then elections, and then Ukraine gets control of its eastern international border. Not a perfect deal, and a lot less smooth than what I outlined. But it did say that the Donbass was part of Ukraine. Putin's blown that up. The sanctions got him to pull back and stop the offensive, recognize that the Donbass was Ukrainian. But he did not pull out of Ukraine. He did not negotiate Minsk in good faith. And here we are. Success or failure. They bought time. Time, in retrospect, we didn't use. The Trump administration they launched some new sanctions. Some of them were like creative but badly implemented, but it didn't matter what they did at the professional level. Trump himself was on Putin's side. Come on, we all know this. And good people like Fiona Hill, whose quality the whole country knows now, she was doing her best. I mean, she's great. But the message was incoherent. Putin assumed he had a friend in the White House, and so he did.
Thank you.
So anyway, I will shut up now. But you asked, Courtney, you said talk about Ukraine and Russia. And I've been doing nothing else. That's what I'm doing. Anyway, I'll say more when the time comes.
No, thank you so much. That's fantastic. And I'm sure we'll get more questions on that as time goes by. Erica, turning to you, as I mentioned before, you've done a lot of work on the humanitarian consequences of sanctions. And so, I'd just like for you to delve into that a little bit more about how they're impacting civilians, whether or not targeted sanctions can avoid those impacts, and some of the coping mechanisms that you see both individuals and governments taking in affected countries.
Thanks, Courtney, and thanks very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be back here once again. And I should add, before I proceed in answering your question, I should build on what Ambassador Fried has just said. The two of us actually had shared our first contact about 6 years ago when I was working on a report assessing impacts and effectiveness of the first round of Russia sanctions imposed by the US and the EU. So I'm sure we'll have a good discussion on that afterwards as well. But so turning to the question of humanitarian impacts. Now, this is a really interesting question because those of us here, or those of you in the audience who have followed sanctions for a long time, will remember that there was a big furore, a big outcry about the humanitarian impacts of some of the earlier comprehensive sanctions, that's to say embargoes that were employed by the UN and the US back in the 1990s, especially those regarding Iraq, the former Yugoslavia, Haiti, Cuba, and so on. So around 20 years ago, we had the advent of what is known as targeted sanctions, and the real rationale behind them is that they should avoid negative impacts on ordinary people, on civilians. So in a way, we're moving into a new phase of sanctions practice, really over the last 10 years or so. And before I talk about what we know regarding some of the humanitarian impacts, what I would say is that separating cause and effect is a really difficult challenge. The other speakers today will know this very well. It's really hard to work out what impacts sanctions are having over and above anything else that's going on in any given situation. And working out the impacts of sanctions is actually made more difficult in contexts where there's conflicts going on, humanitarian crises, where there may be disinformation or propaganda, where access to reliable data is also a challenge. So that's my big caveat here, is it's very hard for us to know for sure. Sanctions, we know, don't work in isolation. And also we know that they're only as good as the wider approach that's being used, the wider strategy, how they're combined with other policy instruments. And this is what Ambassador Fried was also saying earlier. So let's turn to what we know about contemporary sanctions practice, what's going on in recent years. So what we're seeing, there are a number of levels, there are a number of different things happening, a number of different drivers that in my view are causing concern on a number of levels relating to humanitarian matters. So the first is that some sanctions regimes that are in place today, and here I'm referring to those that may be imposed by the US, the EU, some of the other partners as well that tend to impose sanctions together, and sometimes also the UN sanctions. What we're seeing is a return to broader measures. A number of different, I guess, really high-profile sanctions regimes include some really hard-hitting sectoral measures in cases such as Syria and Iran, for example. The central bank is sanctioned, as are many government ministries, the oil and gas sectors and so on. And I know many of you will be thinking now of Russia, of course, where we're seeing an incredibly rapid and quite astonishing range of new sanctions on an unprecedented level being imposed. So alongside this return to broader measures in some contexts, it's definitely not in all. I would say what we see this in the countries I've mentioned already, also in North Korea, Venezuela, and a few others. Another thing that we're seeing is that there's a real proliferation in sanctions use. What we see is that UN sanctions use has stabilized to an extent in the last few years, but at the same time, the use of autonomous sanctions or unilateral sanctions by the US and the EU in particular has absolutely rocketed. And on top of that, we have a range of new sanctioning actors. And you may be surprised to learn that there are actually various countries now in Latin America, in Asia, Africa, Middle East, and so on, that are starting to use their own autonomous sanctions as well. Not least, of course, China, with its recently adopted legislation to allow it to impose sanctions as well. What we see, of course, is that sanctions are increasingly sophisticated, but sometimes they're lacking on a number of different levels, whether it's poor planning or not being assessed effectively. Sanctions lifting isn't always part of the strategy, which means it kind of ends up in these protracted sanctions regimes. Another problem is overlapping sanctions regimes. What we're seeing now is a really complex web of different measures in certain countries, like in Syria, where we have a whole load of different regional organizations, EU, League of Arab States, a whole load of countries and so on, all applying sanctions on similar targets at the same time. So this makes it very confusing for private sector, NGOs and so on, working out what they can do in those countries. And that includes companies that are trading in essential goods like medicines and food and vaccines. And it includes NGOs carrying out humanitarian assistance, development, and so on. On top of that, it hasn't finished yet. On top of that, there's an increased complexity of other types of regulations. We have anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism measures, counter-terrorism listings, export controls, at the same time. So once again, it's a very complicated compliance environment. On top of that, the last point I'd like to make is that US enforcement in particular, especially under the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration, has resulted in fines to financial institutions and banks that can sometimes enter into the billions of US dollars or euros. So you can see here that banks and so on tend to start withdrawing from certain countries where there are a lot of sanctions in place, where you have these complicated webs of sanctions. And we term this over-compliance or de-risking, where banks, but this also extends to private sector companies, will pull out or will reduce their exposure to these countries. And in certain instances, it can leave entire countries, what we might call unbanked or financially excluded. And this serves as a bit of a vicious circle, because what we know is that financial exclusion leads to, is a driver of conflict. It's also a driver of human rights abuses, such as modern slavery and human trafficking. So you have here sanctions and other measures tackling really important foreign policy and security considerations. But at the same time, if not strategically and carefully used, they can end up resulting in certain parts of the world essentially being completely cut off from the financial system. I'll maybe just conclude here to say that I would say that there's direct humanitarian impacts, such as things like increased inflation, a rise in fuel costs in certain places, reduction in electricity, reduced social spending, cuts to remittances, barriers to trade, and so on, with the caveat, of course, that there are often lots of other drivers in place. Another really key area is the impacts that sanctions and counterterrorism regulations can have on humanitarian action. NGOs and even UN agencies working to provide humanitarian assistance to vulnerable communities around the world, when there are sanctions in place, it can cause a range of problems like inability to make payments, humanitarian payments into those countries. We were seeing this recently with Afghanistan, increased bureaucracy, also risk of fines and reputational risks, restrictive donor agreements, and also the problem that NGOs find that they're not necessarily able to provide aid to everybody or assistance to everybody. And this sits in direct contravention of international humanitarian law, which is the international law governing armed conflict, whereby humanitarian assistance should be neutral and independent. So of course, if one NGO, for example, finds it can't provide assistance to a terrorist organization or members of it, or a soldier that's part of a sanctioned government, this sits in contravention for them of the humanitarian principles of neutrality and independence. And what we find is that the exemptions or licensing carve-outs in all sanctions regimes are almost always not enough to provide for adequate trade in essential goods and NGO activities and so on.
Great, thank you. Ben, turning to you, given some of what Erica just said about some of the challenges, do we need to take a step back and reassess how we look at sanctions? And do you think that we've reached a critical point in the use of sanctions? I'd love to just get your thoughts on how we address some of those challenges that Erica laid out.
Yeah, so the way I would have answered this question, last week is probably different than how I'd answer it today. So maybe I will take it up to the present. One thing that's been striking is the speed at which the US and Europe and Japan and other countries have all come together to impose sanctions on Russia. I mean, it's sort of breathtaking how quickly this has all happened. And, you know, this reflects sort of the fruition of years of experimentation and learning how to impose sanctions in the modern financial system. It reflects, I think, a lot of diplomacy from the Biden administration. And it also reflects this, you know, impressive moment of global solidarity with Ukrainians. And so I think that last point is, on the one hand, heartening, on the other hand, a little bit worrisome. This is, you know, we're sort of in uncharted territory with sanctions against, you know, of this magnitude against a country this size, and in particular against a country that has nuclear weapons, as well as other ways of retaliating. So I think it's, you know, one thing to talk about is I guess this gets back to Ambassador Fried's point, is, you know, what exactly are the goals here, and what would be the situation in which, you know, the United States and others would be willing to lift these sanctions. So I think it's important to think now about diplomacy and you know, what sort of negotiated settlement might be reached that would allow for the end of violence in Ukraine and the lifting of sanctions. To take a step further back, you know, three things that this brings up when we think about sanctions. One is, you know, highlights the role of renewable energy going forward. Thinking about, you know, the biggest carve out in these current sanctions is for continued sale of energy products to, you know, in particular to Western Europe. The calls for a new task force to actually track down the assets of Putin and his allies in various offshore accounts around the world, and in the United States probably. You know, this is an interesting development. And, you know, one other thing, I mean, I wonder if we can take from the sort of unprecedented way in which you've had so many different nations come together for sanctions. I wonder if there's some possibility to rethink maybe the role of financial power in global governance, to move it away from you know, multiple overlapping unilateral sanctions towards some kind of broader coordination that might be used to serve, you know, global goals rather than the power of individual nations.
Great, thank you. And you brought up 2 points, and I'm going to ask one more question before turning to the Q&A. But you brought up 2 points that we're actually have some briefings on. So you mentioned the energy piece, and so we're doing a briefing next Friday, March 11th, on the geopolitics of the energy transition. So that one's free and open to all. And regarding Putin's assets, we had done a briefing, and Brian, maybe you could put the link in the chat to the video on offshore accounts after Pandora Papers. And so it's not about Putin directly, it's about that world, which I think is quite fascinating. So thank you for bringing those points up. I'm going to turn to you, Ambassador Fried, with my last question before turning to the Q&A box. You know, again, you know, getting back to the elephant in the room, which is Russia. You worked on sanctions policy in 2014, and you talked a lot about what the conditions that are necessary. So how is Russia today different than the Russia that we were sanctioning back in 2014? And, you know, how does that play into what countries worldwide are doing when it comes to sanctioning Russia? And how, from your perspective, from your understanding of the region, you know, what do you anticipate? How do you anticipate them reacting?
Well, we see some of the reaction already. Putin said he was putting his nuclear forces on a heightened state of alert the day after we announced the heavy sanctions. He hates them. He wants to remind us that he has nuclear weapons. It's ugly. Where we are now is much deeper into the sanctions regime than 2014 and 15, like by orders of magnitude. We've hit the central bank. We've locked down about half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. That's Iranian territory on a much, much bigger economy. That's huge. And the totality of the Russian sanctions really is the hammer. It's merited. It's going to hurt. Look, to claim it's not going to hurt the Russian people is to be delusional. Let's face it, it will. I suspect a lot of them will know why. It's Putin who did this. Will they work? Well, as one of my colleagues said, banks don't stop tanks. It is unlikely to have an immediate operational impact on the Russian offensive. But it will have, as I said earlier, could have a profound impact on Russia moving forward. And this war looks like it's not popular in Russia. If Putin pulls off a major victory, which he could, he has the military edge. Let's not comfort ourselves. Kyiv could fall. The government could be decapitated. He could annex big chunks of Ukraine. He could take half the country, Kyiv plus Ukraine east of the Dnieper, leaving the other side, the Western Ukraine, in a kind of rump state. He could do all these things. In the long run, he may have trouble governing it. In fact, I think he would. Where's the Soviet Empire today? But it lasted for a while. You see where I am in this. It's ugly, and these sanctions are going to remain in place for a long time, unless there is a negotiated settlement that effectively restores the status quo ante or close to it, and that Ukraine accepts. I can imagine that if the Russians made a real offer to Ukraine as opposed to their offers for total surrender, Ukraine might accept. And if the conditions, I'm speculating, this is not based on knowledge, but just think it through. If one of the Russian conditions is that the sanctions had to end, the Ukrainians, it's possible they would ask us to drop them in return for the survival of their country. In which case, sanctions would have served at least a major purpose. They would have worked. But this is complete speculation. I think the odds of that scenario are less than Putin escalating so he can win. In which case, we'll see what happens. But where's the Soviet Union today is my answer.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Fried. Thank you all. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box in part because, Erica, you already answered my last question to you, but I'm going to start off with you in the Q&A. And I hope that you might be able to answer this question. So we have a question about whether or not availability of Bitcoin, at least in the context of Russia, would enable it to avoid, at least in part, some of the financial sanctions. So do these alternative cryptocurrencies, do they provide some solvency for affected countries?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I haven't had a chance to look at the Russian context specifically, but what I would say is that the US government has, of course, already placed sanctions against state-created cryptocurrencies in the past. Venezuela is one such example where US sanctions have been targeted against the petro and also any future cryptocurrencies that will be created. And Ambassador Fried may know the latest on that as well. So I think this is one to watch in the Russian context. There's another topic that we need to think about is the role of central bank digital currencies. And every country around the world, every central bank around the world is currently developing its own digital currency, including Russia. So I think this is an area that may in some people's minds, represent a way around some of these issues. But I think ultimately, we're still going to see, in the Russian context, a phenomenon of de-risking, of over-compliance, and also of kind of voluntary boycotts as well. We've just seen in the last couple of days companies such as Volvo and Disney saying they're not going to export to Russia anymore or allow for the programming and so on. And I think this is what we're going to see more widely, is this kind of widespread withdrawal from any interaction with Russia. And I think that will extend to the digital realm as well. We saw that also in Asian firms that are dealing with cryptocurrencies, where they also de-risked from certain heavily sanctioned jurisdictions. So I think we'll probably see the same in the Russian context as well.
Great, thank you. Ben, I'm going to turn to you next. We have a question about, the questioner says that sanctions appear to be an end run around diplomacy. And the questioner states that it seems like the US often weakens its leadership role in the global stage by relying on sanctions. So could you just talk a little bit about that from your research? You know, how have you done any work on what the perception is of US leadership when it comes to the imposition of sanctions, and have you seen it be used as an end run around diplomacy?
Sure. I mean, I haven't done sort of overall work on that, but there's definitely some instances that come to mind. One of them might have been what Ambassador Fried was referring to earlier with sanctions against the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. The Reagan administration sought to prevent the construction of a pipeline from the Soviet Union to Western Europe, and the way that it did it was essentially by third-party sanctions against European companies. So the U.S. would be punishing European companies that honored their contracts with the Soviet Union, and this was obviously quite unpopular in Western Europe. So and you can see a similar sort of thing with the Iran sanctions under Trump, which were sort of reimposed over the protest of many of our allies in Western Europe. I think what's interesting about the current sanctions is how that hasn't really been an issue. That while these sanctions are being imposed not through the United Nations, but through the unilateral actions of various countries, I guess, along with the EU acting collectively, it's almost it's effectively been a multilateral sanctioning effort because of diplomacy. So it hasn't been the United States sort of standing alone. So that's an interesting development, because what we had seen in the last 5 years or so was the reliance of the United States on sanctions was creating a lot of resistance, a lot of attempts to find ways of bypassing it. Europeans created essentially a barter system to try to trade with Iran despite American sanctions. I don't think any of these alternatives have really gone very far, but the reliance of the U.S. on unilateral sanctions is creating a lot of pressure to find workarounds, and so we'll see whether the way in which the U.S. has managed to cooperate so much this time, that perhaps might lead, say, China and Russia to seek, even more strongly to develop some kind of alternative. But on the other hand, perhaps will lessen that, given that it's not purely a unilateral move.
Thank you, Ambassador Fried. I'd like to turn to you right now. I have a question about. The questioner asks, have Western governments overestimated the effectiveness of sanctions when not paired with appropriate military deterrence? Would a combination of softer sanctions with more hard power projection provide more effective and be more effective and less damaging for targeted populations? So I know you're a diplomat, but
odd question. Softer sanctions, really? Softer sanctions would have been ridiculed by the Ukrainians, first of all. I mean, we tried moderate sanctions in 2014 and 2015. Now we've tried heavy sanctions. The question of a harder military response, what does that mean? The Biden's military response in the run-up to the war was twofold. One, arms to the Ukrainians. There could have been more delivered. Okay, there will be a question as to whether we provided enough. At the time, the administration was worried about not seeming to provoke a war by moving too many arms too fast. But that's a question of degree. The other military response was to strengthen NATO's eastern flank, which the Biden administration did. What other military response would have been appropriate? Threats to imply a no-fly zone over Ukraine? That would have meant a direct clash with Russian forces. Does that sound like a good idea? Now, the question might be phrased, where did we fail? I mean, we tried to stop the war and we didn't. So where did we fail?
Do you have an answer to that?
There will be. My answer is there are things we could have done operationally differently. And I think we'd have to look back. Maybe I think in 2016, the Obama administration was a little slow to ramp up the pressure on Putin before we left office. But in 2017, Trump came in and he's on Putin's side.
Right.
The fault for this war lies with Putin. There is a certain class of Western thinker and academic that thinks it always must be our fault. And there are things we could have done better. We'll figure out what that was in retrospect. And that's worth an exercise worth having. But the fault is Putin's. He did it. Anyway, that's an inadequate answer, but it's the best I can do at this time.
Thank you. For the next question, I'm actually going to ask Dariush Manavi, who's in the audience, just to unmic and ask his question.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for the informative presentation. I want to actually disagree with a big part of the thesis that's based on, where's the Soviet Union? First of all, sanctions are de jure, not de facto, against the notion of America gaining currency throughout the world through the spread of economic wealth. They impede our own position as a stable source of not only wealth, but now currency actually in the world. Number two, you asked, where's the Soviet Union? I asked, where's Iran? Where's Turkey? Where's Venezuela? These are countries where the governments have not only survived sanctions, but because they trade in their own personal currency, all right, domestically, it doesn't matter what's going on with the currency overseas. Because they control the currency domestically, they gain strength while the opposition loses strength. That's true in Iran. It's definitely true in Venezuela. And in Turkey, basically Erdogan bankrupted all the hotels and handed all the assets to his friends after we imposed sanctions.
Dariush, would you mind just getting to a question?
Yeah, I'm getting to the question, and I get to the point. Now, why isn't it now that we also have a newer history? Why isn't it, in fact, in the case of Ukraine, dangerous to rely on sanctions? You asked what the answer was. The answer was that Ukraine's probably a buffer state, and it always has been, and probably not guiding Ukraine with the comfort of imposing sanctions, potentially imposing sanctions to stop something, not guiding them into this position where it doesn't look very good for them going forward, where they're going to end up in the same place as a buffer state, as a poor Switzerland. Maybe they could have done that without losing their entire infrastructure. Thank you.
Okay, I have one point about Ukraine. It's not an abstraction. It is not a place. It is not a part of a board game of risk.
Absolutely.
The Ukrainians in 2013, official Ukrainian policy was indeed neutrality. The United States was comfortable with that. The problem was neutrality, according to Vladimir Putin's definition, had to involve not neutrality, but total subordination to Russia and Putin's emerging economic empire. That demand was unsustainable in Ukraine. A neutral Ukraine was something the United States had no problem with, but was made impossible because of Putin's demands. He demands the end of Ukrainian sovereignty, and Ukrainian people aren't willing to live with that. They have agency. They are not abstractions. I actually know Ukrainians. And the desire for them to join Europe, civilizationally as they see it, kind of Europe as a source of democracy and the rule of law, is powerful. That is deeply felt. Russia policy denies them that agency. Therefore, Russian policy is not ultimately sustainable because it leads, as it has been shown, to periodic uprisings by Ukrainians. It is not an abstraction. All right, I'll ask somebody else answer the part about sanctions, but for God's sakes, stop treating them as if they are pieces in a board game of Risk.
Ben or Erica, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. Is that okay, Ben? I would add to that I agree that the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia in the current context are absolutely unprecedented. And so it's going to take some time before we can fully understand what kind of impact they're going to have. What I get very frustrated by is what I see in the press every day. Are the sanctions working? Are they going to work? And I agree with what some of my fellow panelists were saying earlier, that this has to be part of a broader strategy: defense, deterrence, everything from trade relations, referrals to legal tribunals, and so on. This is absolutely vital, and this is sometimes where sanctions fall short, because there isn't necessarily the right kind of dialogue or planning between these various different communities. But I would say that it's I'll conclude there, but I think it's absolutely unprecedented what is happening in the current context with regards to Russia right now, and also that in part because of the fact that it's such a major economy, so integrated with the financial system, but also things like its ability to impose some forms of countermeasures, its ability to adapt economically to some of the sanctions that are imposed, and also things like retaliatory cyber attacks, which could be possible on critical infrastructure in some of the sender countries. So I think the risks here are unparalleled, and this explains why some of the measures have been imposed quite cautiously to date as well.
But I jump in on one thing, which is I think the questioner was at when the reference to sort of Venezuela and Iran. I think the point was, or at least the issue is, how do sanctions affect the power balance within the sanctioned countries? In other words, if you cut off these countries from sort of global financial flows, what impact does that have on the ability of leaders to maintain their power? I think there's some, certainly seen some people sort of speculating about the impact that these sanctions might have on, causing Russians to rise up and overthrow Putin. That doesn't seem likely anytime soon. But certainly economic recession that is influenced by sanctions can lead to political opposition. You could see this to a certain degree in Iran over the last couple of years. But financially, it also can allow the leadership of these countries to sort of enhance their control, given that there's less dependence and the less possibility to rely on outsider funding, can in a way strengthen, at least in the short term, the financial and political power of existing elites.
Thank you. Erica, I'm going to turn to you with this question, which is, what does it mean to freeze overseas assets of Russian oligarchs and financial entities? Will they be unfrozen and returned at some point in time? And could those frozen assets, and this part I think is particularly interesting, could those frozen assets be seized and sold, including to provide aid to Ukrainians?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So when it comes to the assets, for example, of Russian oligarchs overseas, of course, it depends which sanctions regime we're talking about. If it's the EU, the assets are frozen within EU territory, same for the US and so on. The UK sanctions just apply to the UK. So it's worth keeping that in mind. And that's where, of course, the UK plays a really important role here with the City of London and the Russian involvement in the UK property market, education system, and so on. Having said that, I I would defer to Ambassador Fried. He probably has a clearer view, but in my recent work on Afghanistan, what we've seen, of course, is the foreign reserves were maybe not frozen, but suspended or withheld by the US government. And the recent announcement was that approximately half of the reserves will be used to compensate 9/11 victims. The other half would be allocated to humanitarian aid response in Afghanistan in a way that doesn't traverse or seem to benefit the Taliban de facto government in any way. So I think we have precedent for that on one level. I'm also working on a report at the moment looking into the scope of sanctions to address modern slavery and human trafficking. And this was a question raised here as well. Could the assets that are frozen potentially be used to compensate some of the victims? So I think it's a really interesting idea. I'm not quite sure whether there's much precedent of it. Maybe some of the others would know though.
Anyone want to chime in on that?
I guess just one thing I would say is there's a lot of in the U.S. case, there's a lot of complex legal issues about litigation, and I mean that's the issue with the Afghan assets, is that 9/11 victims had sued the Taliban, and a court. Well, the question is whether a court can rule that those assets should be turned over to them or not, and how much leeway does the president have to take those assets and put them elsewhere. There's been a lot of litigation and cases over that, about that over the years. And I guess that, one way to think about this is the legacy of, several decades worth of sanctions that not only do you have, as Dr. Moret was talking about earlier, the sort of overlapping sanctions by various agencies in various countries, but also you have all these overlapping, complicated, legal precedents within the American system. And so if there was an attempt to take the money that had been frozen and send it to Ukrainians, that would, I guess one thing we could say for sure is that a lot of lawyers would end up with a lot of that money before it got anywhere else.
Yeah. I think we have time for one last question, and I'm going to turn to you with this one, Ambassador Fried. The questioner writes, it was assumed that Putin was prepared for Western sanctions in reaction to his invasion of Ukraine. Do you think that he was completely surprised by the unity of the West or the severity of the ones that were imposed? And do you think that they will have any real impact on Russian domestic stability?
The second answer is possibly. The first answer is, I think he anticipated the sanctions that came out on Tuesday, Thursday, and even Friday. That is, the sanctions against the banks, against the export controls against semiconductors, the banning of secondary trading on Russian sovereign debt. He may have priced those in. Those had been anticipated, I think. The central bank sanctions, not anticipated. Oh, sorry about that interference. The secondary sanctions,
If you'd like to take a moment and okay. Well,
let me stop bothering you all.
Okay. Well, I think that is a good place to stop because we're almost at time. So would you like to continue, Ambassador Fried, or not? No. Okay. All right. Well, then on that note, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. The panelists, you were fantastic. Thank you for the great questions. I know that there was also a lot of activity in the chat. So really appreciate it. And yes, as I mentioned, we have some upcoming briefings as well, including one on the energy transition. That's on March 11th, so please do RSVP. We'll try to continue to do some, we're pulling together events on Russia and Ukraine now, so you please check our website for more. And we are still taking applications for our deep dive on China because yes, China still exists. And it's, for those of you in New York, this is a great chance to go beyond the headlines and really understand what's happening with China, because that is still a country that we need to understand. So with that, Ben, Erica, Ambassador Freed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate your time today. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.